You know, trying to get into Hegel can feel like you're staring at a sheer wall of text. It's notoriously difficult. But what if I told you there's a clear, logical first step that kind of unlocks his entire system? Well, today, we're going to find it. We are breaking down the absolute starting point of Hegel's logic, a takedown of a way of thinking that is so natural, so baked into how we see the world, that we barely even notice we're doing it.
Okay, so let's just dive right in with a pretty simple question. Do you think your thoughts can perfectly capture reality? I mean, it seems obvious, doesn't it? We think about a tree, we use words like green and tall, and we just assume that those words, those concepts, latch directly onto the real tree out there. This seems like a perfectly solid foundation for knowledge. But for Hegel, this is exactly where all the problems begin.
You see, that common sense assumption is precisely what Hegel calls the first position of thought. It's our default setting, the uncritical, almost naive way we approach the relationship between our minds and the world. And by taking it apart piece by piece, Hegel is going to show us exactly why we need a completely new and much more dynamic kind of logic.
So, here's our game plan. First, we're going to define this naive faith in thinking. Then we'll see how its whole method of using predicates, descriptions, starts to fall apart. We'll look at its super rigid either-or logic, see how that played out in the old-school metaphysics, and finally, we'll understand why tearing all of this down was such a necessary first step for Hegel.
All right, let's start at the beginning, that common sense starting point. We're talking about the kind of philosophy that was floating around before Kant came in and just shook everything up. Think of it as the default mode for thinking about truth and reality back in the day.
Hegel uses this great German word to describe it, unbefangen. It means something like naive, uninhibited, or even unself-conscious. It's this really innocent faith that when we think about things, our thoughts are just directly reproducing the world as it truly is. There's no doubt here, no skepticism, no worry about a gap between our mind and reality. It's just a complete, uninhibited trust in the power of our concepts.
And just to put this in context, Hegel is pointing his finger directly at what he calls the former metaphysics. He's specifically talking about the school of thought led by Christian Wolff, which was the dominant force in German universities before Kant. Their core belief was simple. The categories we use in our heads, ideas like quality, quantity, cause, effect, they aren't just tools for thinking. No, they believed these were the actual, fundamental building blocks of reality itself. So, how did this kind of metaphysics actually work? Well, its method seems simple enough on the surface, but Hegel, being Hegel, spots a really deep flaw in the very structure of how it talks about things. And this, right here, is the first major crack that starts to unravel the whole foundation. So the method was basically this. You take a subject, let's say the soul, and you treat it like a fixed, unchanging thing, a substrate. Then you just start attaching predicates to it, like you're putting sticky notes on it. The soul is simple. The soul is immortal. But Hegel finds a clue to the problem hidden in the German language itself. He points out that the word for judgment, Urteil, literally has the word for an original division, an urteiling right inside of it. The very act of making a judgment, of saying something is something else, actually breaks apart a unity that should have been there all along.
And this quote just brilliantly lays out the problem. In this old way of thinking, the act of knowing is seen as something we, the knowers, do to a passive object. We are the ones attaching the labels. The thinking process isn't part of the object's own being, it's just this external activity that we perform on it.
Okay, so that's the first crack in the foundation, but it gets deeper. Let's move on to the second major issue. This way of thinking isn't just external, it's also incredibly rigid. Hegel calls this dogmatism. But for him, that has a very specific technical meaning. Right, so for Hegel, dogmatism isn't just about being stubborn or closed-minded. It's about being trapped by the either-or logic of what he calls the understanding. This is the kind of black and white thinking that insists that for any two opposing statements, like say, the world is finite versus the world is infinite, one of them absolutely has to be true, and the other absolutely has to be false. There is no gray area, no middle ground, period. And this whole approach is grounded in the most basic bedrock laws of formal logic. The principle of non-contradiction, which says something can't be both A and not A at the same time, and the law of the excluded middle, which says something must be either A or not A. These principles seem unshakable, right? But Hegel is about to show us their limits. So here's the million-dollar question. What happens when you take this rigid, finite, either-or logic and you try to apply it to concepts that are, by their very nature, infinite or unconditioned?
Can you really talk about something like God or the totality of the world using these neat little boxes designed to draw sharp, distinct lines? Well, this is exactly where the whole system just completely breaks down.
So, let's see how this flawed logic actually played out in the real world. Or, well, in the world of philosophy. Hegel walks us through the 4 major branches of the old metaphysics, and what he finds is the exact same fundamental error, repeated over and over again.
First up, you had ontology, which studied being itself, but it treated categories like quality and quantity as if they were their own separate, independent things. Then there was rational psychology, which did the same thing to the soul, turning it into a static soul thing. Next, rational cosmology treated the entire world as just a fixed object for our minds to classify. And finally, rational theology tried to understand God by just pinning a list of finite qualities onto some abstract highest essence. Do you see the pattern here? In every single case, a dynamic, living reality gets frozen into a static, dead object.
So, you might be thinking, why is Hegel spending all this time just tearing down this old way of thinking? It might seem purely destructive. But his goal isn't just destruction. By showing us exactly how and why the old system fails, he's demonstrating the absolute necessity of his new one.
Hegel's final verdict is this. The first position commits one fundamental error. It objectifies the true. It takes the living, breathing, dynamic process of thought and reality and treats it like a dead collection of fixed things and categories. It basically turns a verb into a noun.
And this quote makes a really crucial point. Hegel is not an anti-metaphysician. He's not trying to get rid of metaphysics. He believes that logic, when it's done right, is metaphysics. So his critique isn't meant to end metaphysics, but to transform it from a rigid, dogmatic system into a self-critical, dynamic one. The big takeaway here is that idea of necessity. See, the old metaphysics doesn't fail just because Hegel says it's wrong. It fails on its own terms. When it tries to think about something infinite, its own logic ties itself in knots and breaks down into contradictions. And it's this internal collapse that makes a new kind of logic not just an interesting idea, but an absolute necessity. And this new logic is radically different. It's a complete inversion of the old way of thinking. For the old static logic, a contradiction is an error. It's a mistake, a dead end. Thought is just a tool we use to classify a reality that's already out there, fixed. But for Hegel's dialectical logic, contradiction isn't an error at all. It's the very engine of progress. It's the productive force that drives both thought and reality itself forward. Which leaves us with one final provocative question that changes everything. If a contradiction isn't a mistake, then what is it? For Hegel, it means you're on the verge of a deeper truth. It isn't the end of the argument, it's the beginning of the real journey. And that, right there, is the radical first step into Hegel's logic.
Das Wahre ist das